What happens when a famous actor goes on a morning talk show expecting a friendly chat but gets attacked instead? This is the story of how one terrible interview went completely wrong and ended with one of the most shocking moments in television history. Hugh Grant arrived at the television studio on a Tuesday morning feeling calm and relaxed. He was there to talk about his new romantic comedy movie that was coming out in theaters soon. Morning talk shows were supposed to be easy and fun. Actors would tell nice stories, make people laugh, and remind everyone to go see their new movie. Hugh had done this kind of thing hundreds of times before. It was just part of being an actor. The makeup artist finished working on his face to make sure he looked good on camera. Then someone from the show knocked on his dressing room door and told him they were ready for him. Hugh straightened his tie and took a deep breath. He felt confident because he knew exactly what to expect. He would walk out, wave to the people watching, sit down in the guest chair, answer some questions about making the movie, maybe tell a funny story about working with the other actors, and then remind everyone when the movie was opening. It was simple, and he had done it so many times that it felt automatic. When Hugh walked onto the brightly lit television set, the audience clapped and cheered loudly. The four women who hosted the show, called Loose Women, were sitting behind their desk. Each of them had coffee cups and papers with notes in front of them. Denise Welch sat in the middle seat. You could tell she was the most important host because of the way she sat and how the other women looked at her for direction. The host welcomed Hugh warmly, and he sat down in the guest chair across from them. Camera operators moved around getting ready to film from different angles. Hugh smiled his famous, slightly awkward, but charming smile that people loved. Everything seemed normal at first. Denise started talking in that friendly voice that television hosts use. She said it was lovely to have him there. But then, before they could talk about his new movie, she said she had to ask him about something that had been in the tabloid newspapers recently. Hugh's smile got a little tighter. This was strange. Usually these interviews started with pleasant small talk about the weather or how early morning television was. They didn't usually jump right into personal questions. Hugh politely said he would rather talk about the film. He mentioned that it was really funny and that the other actors in it were very talented. He thought the viewers would enjoy hearing about working with them. But Denise didn't listen to what he wanted. She leaned forward with a look in her eyes that reminded Hugh of aggressive tabloid reporters. She said they would get to the movie eventually, but surely he understood that viewers were curious about his personal life. After all, he had been quite the romantic figure over the years. The other hosts looked at each other with surprise. This wasn't what they had planned to talk about before the show started. They were supposed to keep things light and let Hugh promote his movie. The plan was to focus on how he was returning to romantic comedy movies after spending several years doing more serious dramatic films. Hugh carefully explained that he had always tried to keep his private life private. He thought that was healthier for everyone. His personal relationships weren't really important when it came to whether people would enjoy watching him in a funny romantic movie. The audience laughed at the way Hugh made fun of himself, but Denise kept pushing. She said he was a public figure, and people were interested in the real Hugh Grant, not just the characters he played. There had been some interesting developments in his love life lately, hadn't there? Hugh shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The bright studio lights suddenly felt much hotter. He could see the camera operators zooming in to get closer shots of his face. This was starting to feel less like a friendly interview, and more like he was being interrogated. He said he wasn't sure what she was talking about, even though his tone of voice made it clear he knew exactly what was coming next. Denise smiled, but it wasn't a warm or friendly smile anymore. She mentioned that there had been reports about his relationship status, some pretty explosive claims about how he had behaved in past relationships. Didn't he think his fans deserved to know what kind of man they were supporting when they bought tickets to his movies? The question hung in the air like poison. Hugh's jaw got tight, and for a moment his charming act completely disappeared. This wasn't journalism. This was destroying someone's character and calling it celebrity gossip. Hugh spoke slowly, and his voice had a hard edge that people who only knew him from romantic comedies rarely heard. He said that his fans support his work, not his personal life, and he thought that was exactly how it should be. But Denise had smelled weakness, and she wasn't going to let Hugh escape easily. She said that surely he could see how some people might think that was very convenient. He could play the charming romantic leading man on screen, But when it came to real-life relationships, the stories people heard painted quite a different picture, didn't they? The other hosts were clearly uncomfortable now. One of them, who was newer to the show, tried to interrupt and suggested they talk about the film. She said she would love to hear about working with the other actors. But Denise cut her off sharply, saying they could do that in a moment. She never took her eyes off Hugh. She said this topic was important. She reminded everyone that Hugh had been married for several years now, but before that, there had been some pretty public incidents. Some embarrassing situations that might make people question whether he was really the romantic hero he played on screen. The studio became very quiet and uncomfortable. Hugh's hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The audience that had been laughing at his charming jokes just minutes before now sat in stunned silence. They could sense that something had shifted from playful conversation to something much darker and meaner. Hugh asked if she was seriously bringing up tabloid gossip from decades ago on morning television. Was this what passed for journalism on this show? His voice was carefully controlled, but you could hear that he was very angry and trying to hold it back. Denise's smile got wider. She was feeding off his discomfort like a predator that senses its prey is getting weaker. She told him not to get defensive. She was simply asking the questions that she thought viewers wanted answered. After all, he was asking them to spend their hard-earned money on his film. Didn't they have a right to know who they were supporting? Hugh shot back that they had a right to know whether the film was worth watching. They didn't have a right to pick apart his personal relationships from 20 years ago. That wasn't journalism. That was being a voyeur, someone who gets pleasure from invading other people's privacy. His famous charm was completely gone now. The camera operators kept filming, capturing every small expression on Hugh's increasingly frustrated face. The director watching from the control room was probably thrilled with the drama unfolding live on television. This was the kind of moment that would be replayed over and over on social media and entertainment news shows. Denise laughed in a sharp, harsh way. She said he was a public figure who had made millions of pounds trading on his romantic image. Surely he couldn't pick and choose which parts of that image he wanted people to see. He wanted to be the charming, bumbling Englishman on screen, but heaven forbid anyone ask about the real man behind the character. One of the other hosts, who was clearly horrified by how the interview was going, tried to do damage control. She suggested they move on to discussing Hugh's new film. She was sure viewers would love to hear about the comedy elements. But Denise snapped at her that she wasn't finished. She didn't even look at her colleague. Her complete focus stayed locked on Hugh like a cat playing with a wounded mouse. Denise said she wanted to talk about accountability, about how celebrities think they can separate different parts of their lives. They want the fame, the fortune, and the adoration, but none of the scrutiny that comes with it. Hugh suddenly stood up. His chair scraped against the studio floor with a harsh sound that echoed through the suddenly silent space. He said this was absolutely ridiculous. He came there to talk about a film, not to be ambushed with tabloid psychology from someone who clearly had her own agenda. Denise commanded him to sit down. Her voice took on an authoritative tone that suggested she was used to controlling what happened on her show. She said they weren't finished. There were some important conversations that needed to be had about celebrity responsibility. Hugh's voice rose. His famous stammer was completely gone now, replaced by crystal-clear anger. He asked, what about journalist responsibility? What about the responsibility to treat guests with basic human decency instead of turning a promotional interview into character assassination? The audience was completely silent now, watching this car crash happen in real time. Some people looked uncomfortable while others seemed riveted by the drama. The other hosts sat frozen, not sure whether to step in or let the situation play out. Denise fired back, telling him not to lecture her about journalism. She had been doing this longer than he had been making films. Part of her job was asking the questions that mattered, not just serving up easy promotional questions for celebrities who thought they were above scrutiny. Hugh's voice dripped with disbelief as he repeated her words back to her. Questions that matter? She was dredging up tabloid stories from decades ago and trying to pass it off as some kind of moral crusade. This wasn't journalism. It was exploitation. It was using her platform to bully guests who couldn't fight back without looking like the bad guy. Denise said with satisfaction that he was fighting back plenty. She thought viewers were getting a very clear picture of the real Hugh Grant right now. Not the charming romantic lead, but someone who got angry when asked to account for his past behavior. Hugh's composure finally cracked completely. He asked what past behavior she was talking about. Being young and making mistakes, dating people and having relationships that didn't work out? Was that what she was calling past behavior that needed accounting for? Having a normal human life? The confrontation had gone far beyond anything the show's producers had planned. This was supposed to be a light morning chat with a beloved actor promoting his latest film. Instead, it had turned into a public character assassination that was growing more vicious by the moment. Denise pressed her advantage ruthlessly. She questioned whether he would call it a normal human life, because some of the women who had been in his life might describe it rather differently. There had been stories about how he treated people. When the cameras weren't rolling, when he wasn't playing the charming Englishman, Hugh's face turned red with anger and humiliation. The studio lights beat down mercilessly, capturing every moment of his distress for the cameras that kept rolling without pause. He said it was incredible. She was actually repeating unsubstantiated gossip as if it were fact, as if anonymous sources quoted in tabloids were some kind of gospel truth. Denise pushed harder, asking if he was denying the stories. Was he saying that every single report about his behavior in relationships had been made up? That there was no truth to any of it? Hugh replied, his voice shaking with fury, that his private life was private. Mistakes he may have made in personal relationships were between him and the people involved, not between him and the television audience, not between him and her. But Denise wasn't done. She had found her weapon, and she intended to use it until her target was completely destroyed. She said she found it fascinating how defensive he was getting. If there was nothing to hide, if all these reports were just tabloid nonsense, then surely a simple denial would be enough. But instead, he was getting angry and deflecting. That told her, and she thought it told the viewers, that perhaps there was more truth to these stories than he would like to admit. Hugh stared at her in complete disbelief. The manipulation was so obvious and so calculated that for a moment he seemed unable to respond. Finally, he said it was unbelievable. She was actually trying to use his natural reaction to being ambushed as evidence of guilt. That wasn't journalism, that was entrapment. Denise replied smugly that it was called holding people accountable, something that didn't happen enough in Hollywood if you asked her. Too many people got away with too much for too long, and then they acted shocked when someone finally asked them the hard questions. The other hosts sat in mortified silence, early wanting to end this disaster but unsure how to intervene without making things worse. The audience remained transfixed, watching what had become less of an interview and more of a public execution. Hugh's voice cracked with incredulous laughter. Hard questions? Hard questions about what? About tabloid gossip? About relationships that ended years ago? About private matters that had absolutely nothing to do with the film he was there to promote? These weren't hard questions. They were invasive personal attacks disguised as journalism. Denise's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. She said she hadn't attacked him personally at all. She had simply asked about his past behavior and his accountability for that behavior. If he considered that an attack, then perhaps that said more about his conscience than it did about her questions. That was the exact moment when Hugh Grant's patience finally snapped completely. His face went from flushed to pale in seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet but filled with a controlled rage that was far more frightening than his earlier shouting. He said that in over 30 years in the business, he had sat through thousands of interviews with journalists, talk show hosts, and entertainment reporters. Some good, some bad, some indifferent. But never in all those years had he encountered someone so deliberately cruel and so willfully destructive as what he was witnessing right now. Denise opened her mouth to respond, but Hugh held up a hand to stop her. He said she had her say, and now he was going to have his. She wanted to talk about accountability? Let's talk about hers. She invited him there under false pretenses. She told his publicist this would be a standard promotional interview about his new film. Instead, she had used her platform to launch a coordinated attack on his character based on nothing but tabloid speculation and de-anonymous gossip. The studio was dead silent now except for Hugh's voice, which carried clearly through the space without needing amplification. He talked about responsibility. What about her responsibility as a broadcaster? What about her responsibility to treat guests with basic human dignity? What about her responsibility to viewers to provide actual journalism instead of tabloid trash masquerading as meaningful conversation? Denise tried to interrupt, but Hugh said sharply that he wasn't finished. His years of Shakespearean training gave his voice a commanding presence that filled the entire studio. He said she sat there in her position of power, hiding behind the pretense of journalism, using her platform to bully and humiliate people who came there in good faith. She talked about accountability, but where was hers? When did she account for the damage she did? When did she account for the pain she caused? The cameras continued rolling, capturing every word of what was becoming one of the most dramatic moments in daytime television history. Hugh's famous charm was completely gone, replaced by raw, honest anger that was somehow more compelling than any performance he had ever given on screen. He continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. This wasn't journalism. This was exploitation. This was using human pain and private struggles as entertainment for the audience. This was taking someone's lowest moments, their private failures, their personal relationships, and turning them into content for the show, and she had the audacity to call it accountability. Denise finally found her voice and said he was being completely unreasonable. She was simply doing her job. Hugh laughed bitterly. Her job? Her job was to interview people, not to destroy them. Her job was to inform the audience, not to feed them gossip and speculation. Her job was to be a professional broadcaster, not a tabloid bully with a television platform. He began walking toward the exit, his microphone still attached, his words carrying clearly through the studio. He said, if she wanted a story, here was her story. This is what happens when journalism dies and gets replaced by voyeurism. This is what happens when entertainment becomes more important than human dignity. This is what happens when people in positions of power forget that their guests are human beings, not content to be consumed. One of the other hosts pleaded desperately, asking him to please sit down so they could finish this properly. Hugh turned back briefly, his face showing a mixture of disgust and profound sadness. Finish this properly? There was nothing proper about this. There never was. This was designed to be an ambush from the moment he walked through that door. Well, congratulations, Denise. She got her dramatic television moment. He hoped it was worth it. He reached the edge of the set and paused one final time, looking directly into the camera. He wanted anyone watching to understand something. He came there that day to talk about a film he was proud of, a film he hoped would make people laugh and feel good for a couple of hours. Instead, he had been subjected to character assassination based on tabloid gossip and speculation. If this was what passed for journalism on daytime television, then everyone was in serious trouble. With those final words, Hugh Grant walked off the Loose Women set, leaving behind stunned silence, mortified hosts, and one of the most dramatic moments in the show's history. The cameras continued rolling for several more seconds, capturing Denise's shocked face and the uncomfortable shuffling of her co-hosts before finally cutting to commercial break. In just 39 seconds, everything had changed. What was supposed to be a simple, friendly promotional interview had turned into a public confrontation that would be talked about for years to come. Hugh Grant had walked into that studio expecting a routine morning chat, and walked out having delivered one of the most powerful rebukes of tabloid journalism ever captured on live television.